The signatures beneath the empire. This fictional dramatization is for entertainment and does not provide legal advice. Stay until the final document is opened in court, because the billionaire who humiliated his pregnant wife believed he had buried her beneath her own signatures. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments whether trust should excuse a person from reading every paper placed in front of them. Now listen carefully, because Charlotte Hayes Crawford did sign the documents that threatened to destroy her, but she never agreed to the crime hidden inside them. At 2:17 in the morning, Charlotte stepped through the iron gates of the Crawford estate with one suitcase, a dead phone, and a child moving beneath her heart. Rain struck the marble driveway. Behind her, 47 illuminated windows made the mansion look less like a home than a museum built to preserve lies. 6 hours earlier, Charlotte had attended the Crawford Foundation's annual literacy gala in Manhattan. She had helped create the foundation when Ethan Crawford's company was still struggling for national recognition. For 9 years, she had stood beside him at charity events, signed donor letters, and listened while he promised that wealth would never become an excuse for cruelty. That night, Ethan broke the promise beneath television lights. Charlotte was 7 months pregnant. She wore a dark green maternity gown and the pearl earrings her father had given her at college graduation. Ethan barely looked at her when they entered the ballroom. He spent the first hour beside Vanessa Hale, the company's executive vice president and daughter of board chairman Victor Hale. Everyone in the room knew about the affair before Charlotte did. She learned from the way conversations stopped when she approached, from the way Vanessa rested her hand on Ethan's arm, from the pity in the eyes of employees who had signed non-disclosure agreements and convinced themselves silence was professionalism. During the dinner, a reporter asked Charlotte about rumors of missing foundation funds. "I am not aware of any missing funds," she said. Vanessa appeared beside her. "Charlotte has been under significant strain. She may not remember every authorization." Charlotte turned. "What authorizations?" Ethan joined them with several board members and 2 photographers. "This is not the time," he said. "You let her suggest I cannot remember documents I signed." Vanessa smiled. "No one said you were incapable. You said I did not remember." Ethan lowered his voice. Apologized to Vanessa. For what? For accusing her of misleading the press. Charlotte looked around. Cameras were already pointing toward them. Vanessa's father, Victor, stood near the stage. At 68, he had the stillness of a man accustomed to controlling rooms without appearing to move. He nodded once to Ethan. That signal would later matter. Ethan stepped closer to Charlotte. "You have embarrassed this company enough." "This company? You signed the transfers." Charlotte felt the room tilt. "What transfers?" Vanessa held out a folder. Inside were copies of 7 payment approvals bearing Charlotte's signature. More than $14 million had moved from charitable accounts to consulting companies she did not recognize. The signatures were hers. Months earlier, Ethan had placed documents beside her breakfast and described them as routine grants, insurance renewals, and vendor approvals. Charlotte had signed because she had signed hundreds of legitimate foundation papers before them. Now the pages displayed different schedules and account instructions beneath familiar signature sheets. "You changed the documents," she whispered. Ethan looked toward the board. "This is exactly the instability we have been trying to manage." Charlotte's fear became anger. "You used me." Vanessa stepped forward. "Lower your voice. Tell them where the money went." Ethan said, "Apologize." Charlotte laughed once, not from humor, but disbelief. Victor approached. "Mrs. Crawford, the responsible thing is to acknowledge that pregnancy and stress have affected your judgment." Charlotte looked at him. "You are part of this." The ballroom became silent. Victor's security director moved toward her. Ethan pointed to the floor beside Vanessa. "You want to prove you are still capable of acting with dignity? Kneel, apologize, and leave before this becomes worse." No husband with a momentary loss of temper had prepared altered documents, photographers, security, and a public claim of instability. Charlotte understood that the humiliation was not about the affair. It was evidence they were manufacturing. She did not kneel. She removed her wedding ring and placed it on top of the folder. Then Vanessa caught her wrist. "Do not walk away from me." Charlotte pulled free. Her heel slipped against spilled champagne, and she struck one knee on the floor. Cameras captured the instant from across the room. Ethan looked down at her. "Now apologize." Charlotte raised her face. "You will never make that photograph mean what you planned." A woman near the press table stood and shouted, "I recorded everything." Security moved toward the woman. Guests lifted their phones. Charlotte pushed herself upright and walked out while the ballroom dissolved into questions. The woman who had shouted was Margaret Sloan, a 56-year-old attorney invited by an anonymous Crawford Holdings employee. She followed Charlotte into the ring. A black sedan stopped beside them. "Mrs. Crawford," Margaret said, "you need medical care, and then you need to see what your husband has been doing with your name." Charlotte stared at the stranger. "Who sent you?" "Someone inside the company who believes the gala was designed to make you look unreliable before regulators learn about the transfers." The rear door opened. Charlotte looked back once at the hotel, where Ethan's public relations team was already telling reporters that his pregnant wife had suffered an emotional episode. Then she entered the car. By sunrise, she would learn that the affair was only the visible betrayal. The deeper one carried her signature. Margaret took Charlotte first to a private hospital, where an obstetrician confirmed that the fall had bruised her knee but had not injured the baby. Her blood pressure was elevated, so she remained for monitoring until morning. Only after the doctor was satisfied did Margaret open the folder she had brought. "I am not your attorney yet," she said. "Until we sign an agreement and check for conflicts, I am simply showing you information someone believed you needed." The first page listed 3 companies: Northline Advisory, Meridian Civic Partners, and Alder Street Media. All had received foundation money approved with Charlotte's signature. All had been created within the previous 18 months. Their addresses led to mail services, empty offices, or attorneys who formed companies for clients. The second page contained copies of the documents Charlotte remembered signing. The signature pages were genuine. The schedules attached to them were not the schedules Ethan had shown her. "This is called page substitution," Margaret explained. "The important distinction is that you did sign. Our case cannot depend on pretending otherwise. The question is what you were told, what was attached at the time, and who changed or used the completed documents." Charlotte felt embarrassed by her own trust. "I should have read everything." "You should read what you sign," Margaret said. "That is good advice. It is not permission for another person to obtain your signature by fraud." The third page showed internal messages instructing staff to route approvals through Charlotte because her foundation authority creates distance from operations. One message came from Ethan. Another came from Victor Hale. Vanessa's father had invested in Crawford Holdings when the company was near collapse. In exchange, he gained board influence, access to lenders, and a private loyalty Ethan had never fully explained to Charlotte. Victor was not protecting Ethan's fortune. Ethan was protecting Victor's network of shell vendors and political consultants. The anonymous source had begun copying records 6 weeks earlier. The source believed Victor planned to blame the transfers on Charlotte, force Ethan to distance himself publicly, and replace her at the foundation with Vanessa. The affair served both emotional and strategic purposes. At 9 that morning, Margaret's conflict check cleared. Charlotte signed a representation agreement and authorized a forensic review of her devices and records. Margaret then explained the legal path. They could seek immediate orders in New York Supreme Court preserving documents, restricting disputed transfers, and preventing destruction of foundation records. Charlotte could begin a matrimonial action separately. She could also bring civil claims based on fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and the misuse of her name and authority. Federal or state regulators might investigate the transfers, but Margaret did not control whether anyone would be charged. "There will not be a full trial next week," she said. "There may be an emergency hearing about preserving assets. The larger case will take months, possibly years. What happens to me while they tell everyone I stole $14 million? We move quickly where we can and carefully where we must." Margaret filed an emergency application supported by Charlotte's affidavit, copies of the internal messages, and evidence that company personnel had remotely wiped one employee's laptop after the gala. The court issued a temporary preservation order. It required relevant parties to retain emails, accounting files, access logs, board materials, and original versions of documents. It also restricted further movement from identified foundation accounts pending a hearing. The order did not declare Charlotte innocent. It protected the evidence needed to determine what had happened. Ethan was served at Crawford Holdings headquarters. His first response was personal. He called Charlotte from an unknown number. "You are destroying everything we built." She recorded the date and time in a notebook but did not secretly record the call. New York permits one-party consent in many circumstances, but Margaret had instructed her to avoid unnecessary disputes and communicate through counsel whenever possible. "You used my signatures," Charlotte said. "You signed the approvals. You changed what they approved. Do you know what Victor can do to this company?" The question confirmed more than Ethan intended. Charlotte remained silent. Ethan continued, "Come home. We can say the pregnancy affected you. You will step down for a year. The foundation will reimburse the accounts, and no one has to know. You want me to confess to something you did. I want to protect our child's future. Our child's future begins with knowing her mother did not accept your lie." She ended the call. At the preservation hearing, Ethan's lawyers argued that Charlotte was using a marital conflict to interfere with corporate operations. Victor's counsel described the messages as incomplete and warned that freezing payments could harm employees and charitable programs. Margaret asked for a targeted order, not a shutdown. She proposed independent accounting supervision over the disputed accounts and inspection of original documents by neutral experts. The judge adopted much of that approach. Legitimate payroll and approved grants could continue. Disputed vendor payments required independent review. The parties were ordered to preserve records and prepare for expedited discovery on the source and use of Charlotte's signature pages. Outside court, reporters asked whether Charlotte had stolen from her own foundation. She gave one answer. "I signed papers my husband described falsely. I will not hide that fact, and I will not accept responsibility for documents that were changed and used without my informed approval." The honesty surprised Ethan's public relations team. They had expected denial. That afternoon, Crawford Holdings issued a statement emphasizing that Charlotte admitted signing the documents. Margaret read it and smiled without pleasure. "They think your honesty is a weakness. Is it? No. It means they cannot expose a fact you already told the truth about." Then an encrypted message arrived from the anonymous source. "The original files still exist. Meet me where Victor never enters." Beneath the sentence was the address of a small church 2 hours north of Manhattan. The church stood beside a narrow road near the Hudson River. Margaret brought a licensed investigator and arranged for local security to remain nearby. Charlotte waited inside with rain tapping against stained glass windows. A man entered through a side door. His name was Daniel Mercer, the former director of internal compliance at Crawford Holdings. He had resigned 8 months earlier after Victor ordered him to close an audit into the foundation vendors. "I should have gone to regulators then," Daniel said. "I told myself I needed stronger proof. The truth is I was afraid." He placed a flash drive on the pew. Before Charlotte touched it, Margaret asked how the files had been obtained. Daniel explained which records he had lawfully retained during his employment, which documents had been sent to him, and which files he had copied after receiving a preservation request. Margaret warned him not to access systems without authorization. The goal was to protect evidence, not create new legal problems. Daniel's hand trembled. "The fraud is bigger than Ethan," he said. "Victor built the vendor network. Vanessa managed the public story. Ethan approved the transfers because Victor threatened to call the company's debt." Charlotte remembered Ethan's question on the phone. "Do you know what Victor can do to this company? What is on the drive?" she asked. "Board recordings, audit work papers, vendor ledgers, and the original document packets before the signature pages were substituted." "Why did you ask Margaret to attend the gala?" "Because I saw a communications plan describing you as unstable, jealous, and medically unreliable. I knew they were going to create a public record before the financial story broke." Tires moved across gravel outside. A black SUV entered the church parking lot, slowed near Margaret's investigator, then continued toward the road. Daniel went pale. "That vehicle has followed me twice." The investigator photographed the plate from a safe distance. "No one chased it." Margaret called local police and documented the incident. Later, records would show the SUV belonged to a security contractor hired by Victor Hale's private office. This time, the threat would not disappear from the story. The flash drive was not immediately treated as courtroom evidence. Forensic specialists created an image, calculated verification values, preserved the original, and compared the files against server material produced through discovery. Some documents could not be authenticated and were set aside. Others matched independent backups, email headers, bank records, and meeting calendars. The most important folder contained original grant packets. Each packet showed a legitimate charitable project on top: reading programs, rural libraries, teacher training, and mobile learning centers. Charlotte's signature appeared on the approval page, but the version stored in Crawford Holdings after execution contained a substituted payment schedule directing money to Victor's shell vendors. A document management log showed that Vanessa's executive assistant uploaded several replacement pages. An internal camera showed Vanessa and Ethan entering the records room after normal hours. Neither image proved what they did inside, but access logs showed the packets were modified during the same period. The board recording provided motive. Victor's voice said, "The foundation money buys us time. If anyone asks, Charlotte approved it." Ethan replied, "She will say she was deceived. That is why she must look unstable before she speaks." Vanessa then said, "The gala gives us cameras, donors, and a reason for Ethan to separate from her publicly." There was a pause. Ethan asked, "And after the audit?" Victor answered, "She carries the approvals. You carry the company." The recording did not come from a secret device hidden in a private room. Crawford Holdings routinely recorded certain board committee meetings through its conference system. Daniel had preserved a copy from the compliance archive. The company disputed whether Victor believed the session was being recorded, but the system's visible indicator and standard meeting notice supported authentication and admissibility arguments the court would later decide. Discovery expanded. Margaret retained a forensic accountant, Lydia Chun, whose report traced $14 million through the shell vendors. Some funds paid legitimate invoices, disguising the scheme. Most returned through consulting agreements to entities connected with Victor, political intermediaries, and a troubled development project owned by Ethan. Lydia's work did not rely on dramatic assumptions. Every conclusion tied to bank records, contracts, invoices, and ownership filings. Where a connection remained uncertain, she labeled it uncertain. That discipline strengthened the case. Ethan and Victor tried to blame each other. In deposition, Ethan admitted that Victor had proposed routing payments through the foundation, but claimed he believed the vendors performed real services. He admitted telling staff to use Charlotte's approval authority. He admitted the affair with Vanessa. He denied knowing pages had been substituted. Margaret showed him a message to Vanessa. "Charlotte signs at breakfast. Keep the grant page on top and do not leave the schedules." Ethan stared at it for a long time. "What did you mean?" Margaret asked. "My attorneys have advised me not to speculate about old messages." "You wrote it." "I do not recall the context." Victor's deposition was colder. He described Charlotte as decorative, denied involvement with the vendors, and claimed Daniel had fabricated records after being denied a promotion. Lydia's report linked 2 vendor accounts to a trust benefiting Victor's family. Vanessa testified that her assistant may have uploaded replacement pages without her knowledge. The assistant then produced text messages instructing her exactly which pages to scan. As the evidence grew, federal investigators opened a formal inquiry. Margaret cooperated with lawful requests, but kept Charlotte's civil case separate. Charlotte entered into a proffer process only after obtaining criminal counsel to protect her interests. She provided the original documents, explained her signing routine, and accepted responsibility for failing to review paperwork carefully. Months later, prosecutors informed her that she was considered a witness, not a target, based on the evidence then available. That decision was not a public acquittal. It could change if facts changed, but it allowed Charlotte to breathe for the first time since the gala. Charlotte's public reputation recovered more slowly than her legal status. Search results still displayed photographs of her on one knee beneath headlines questioning the missing money. Margaret connected her with a communications advisor who refused to manufacture a heroic image. Together, they released a timeline supported by court filings and independently verified records. Charlotte also met privately with foundation employees whose grants had been delayed. She did not ask them to excuse her failure to review the final packets. She explained what she knew, what she had missed, and how the new controls would work. One librarian told her that accountability sounded different when it included a person's own mistakes. That comment stayed with Charlotte. She began speaking to nonprofit boards about dual approval, locked document versions, independent vendor checks, and the danger of allowing family relationships to replace governance. The talks were not part of her lawsuit, and they did not prove innocence. They did something quieter. They transformed the lesson from a private humiliation into a practical warning that could keep another trusted signature from becoming a weapon. She gave birth to a healthy boy named Samuel Hayes Crawford. Ethan requested access through the matrimonial court. The judge ordered a structured, supervised parenting process while allegations of coercion and intimidation were evaluated. Charlotte did not ask the civil court to decide custody. Different issues remained in their proper proceedings. During one supervised visit, Ethan held Samuel and began to cry. "I did not think it would go this far," he told the monitor. Charlotte heard about the comment later. The sentence did not comfort her. He regretted the distance traveled by the consequences, not the first step he had chosen. 18 months after the gala, the civil case reached trial in New York Supreme Court. The courtroom was full, but no cameras were permitted inside. Reporters waited in the hallway, where they could publish descriptions after each recess. The judge reminded the parties that the civil jury would decide fraud-related claims, breaches of duty, and damages. It would not determine criminal guilt, sentence anyone, or decide the Crawford divorce. Charlotte entered under her legal name, Charlotte Hayes Crawford. Using both names ended the confusion that had followed her through company records and press coverage. Ethan sat beside his attorneys. Victor and Vanessa had separate counsel. Crawford Holdings had reached a partial agreement to cooperate, preserve records, and establish a restitution fund without admitting every allegation. The jury would still consider specific claims involving the individual defendants. Margaret's opening statement began with Charlotte's admission. "My client signed the pages," she said. "You will hear no attempt to hide that. Trust made those signatures possible. Fraud changed what those signatures were used to approve." She explained that the case would be proved through document versions, server logs, bank trails, witness testimony, and recorded board discussions. She did not promise a secret file. Real evidence rarely arrived in one perfect package. Victor's attorney called Charlotte a sophisticated foundation chair who wanted to avoid the consequences of her own carelessness. Ethan's attorney portrayed him as a weak executive trapped between his wife and a powerful board chairman. Vanessa's attorney argued that administrative staff, not Vanessa, handled the documents. The first witnesses established the records. The foundation's document manager described its normal approval process. Signature pages and schedules were supposed to remain inside a locked digital packet. In the disputed transactions, packets had been reopened after Charlotte signed. Replacement schedules were uploaded from Vanessa's department, and Ethan's executive credentials approved final release. A forensic examiner explained how the files were preserved, compared, and authenticated. She identified which copies came from company servers, which came from Daniel's drive, and which were excluded because their origins could not be sufficiently confirmed. That distinction impressed the jury. The plaintiffs were not asking them to trust every file merely because it was damaging. Lydia Chun then traced the money. She used large charts, but her language remained simple. $14 million left foundation accounts, she said. Approximately 3 million paid projects with some documented charitable value. The remaining funds moved through layered consulting agreements. Several payments returned to entities connected to Mr. Hale. Others supported a development project guaranteed by Mr. Crawford. Victor's lawyer spent hours challenging the connections. "You cannot say my client personally received every dollar." "No," Lydia replied. "You cannot identify the ultimate beneficiary of 2 accounts." "Correct. So your analysis is incomplete. All forensic analyses are limited by available evidence. My report identifies those limits. The documented transfers remain documented." Daniel Mercer testified about his compliance review, his resignation, and the files he preserved. On cross-examination, he admitted waiting months before contacting regulators. "You were afraid for your career?" Victor's attorney asked. "Yes." "You wanted revenge after resigning?" "No. You copied records because you wanted leverage." "I copied records because requests were disappearing and files were being altered." The attorney suggested Daniel had staged the SUV incident. Margaret introduced records showing Victor's office had hired the security contractor and that the vehicle photographed at the church had been assigned to a team monitoring Daniel. Victor's counsel argued that lawful corporate security had been checking for theft of confidential information. The judge allowed the jury to consider the evidence only for limited purposes and warned them not to assume intimidation without examining the full context. Daniel looked toward Victor. I left the company because I was ordered to stop asking questions, he said. They followed me because I finally started answering them. Charlotte testified for most of one day. She described signing documents at breakfast while Ethan summarized them. She identified legitimate packets she remembered reviewing and the altered versions later used to move funds. Victor's attorney confronted her with her education and experience. You served as chair of a major foundation. Yes. You understood that signatures create responsibility. Yes. You could have read every page. I should have insisted on reading every page in its final form. Then this happened because you were careless. It happened because people I trusted deliberately showed me one set of pages and used another. The attorney asked whether she was blaming pregnancy for her decisions. No, Charlotte said. The defendants tried to use my pregnancy to discredit me. I am not using it to excuse myself. Her answer ended one of the defense's strongest themes. Margaret then played the gala footage. The jury saw Ethan point toward the floor, Vanessa grab Charlotte's wrist, Charlotte slip, and Victor signal to security. They heard Charlotte say, "You will never make that photograph mean what you planned." The recording was relevant not because humiliation itself proved every financial transaction. It showed the public strategy described in the communications plan and board recording. Vanessa's former assistant testified under subpoena. She had entered a cooperation agreement with federal authorities but had not received immunity from civil liability. She explained how Vanessa gave her replacement schedules and instructed her to upload them after Charlotte signed. "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked. "I was told the original schedules contained errors." "When did you realize that was false?" "When Vanessa asked me to delete the upload messages after the gala. The assistant had not deleted them. Her phone backup preserved the conversation." Vanessa testified that she had relied on Victor and Ethan and never understood the full scheme. Margaret showed her message. "The gala gives us cameras, donors, and a reason for Ethan to separate from her publicly." "That was about managing a marital announcement," Vanessa said. "Why did a marital announcement require foundation transfer documents?" Vanessa had no answer. Ethan chose to testify. His lawyer presented him as a founder terrified that Victor would call loans, remove financing, and destroy thousands of jobs. Ethan admitted deceiving Charlotte about the documents, but claimed he acted under economic duress. "Did Victor threaten physical harm?" Margaret asked on cross-examination. "No." "Did he threaten an unlawful act against your child?" "No." "He threatened to exercise financial power?" "Yes." "And you responded by sacrificing your wife's name." "I believe the money would be returned." "That was not my question." Ethan looked toward Charlotte. "Yes." Margaret displayed the message. Charlotte signs at breakfast. "Keep the grant page on top and do not leave the schedules." "You wrote instructions for the deception." "I was trying to save the company." "You could have gone to the board." "Victor controlled the board." "You could have gone to regulators." "He would have destroyed us." "You could have told your wife." Ethan's voice dropped. "I was ashamed." Margaret paused. "So instead of sharing your shame, you manufactured hers." The defense objected. The judge sustained the objection and instructed the jury to disregard the phrasing. The point remained. Victor did not testify. The jury was instructed not to treat that choice as proof of liability. His attorneys argued that the vendor network had legitimate political and development purposes and that Ethan acted independently. Then the board recording was authenticated through the conference system administrator, meeting notices, participant testimony, and server records. The courtroom heard Victor say, "The foundation money buys us time. If anyone asks, Charlotte approved it." They heard Ethan warn that Charlotte would say she had been deceived. They heard Victor answer, "That is why she must look unstable before she speaks." Finally, they heard Vanessa propose the gala. The recording ended. No music followed. No narrator told the jury what to think. The silence did enough. Closing arguments began the next morning. Margaret stood beside two versions of the same grant packet. One document funded a literacy program, she said. The other directed money through shell vendors. Charlotte signed the first packet. The defendants used her signature with the second. Carelessness may explain why a person fails to discover fraud immediately. It does not transform fraud into consent. She asked jurors to consider each defendant separately. Ethan had obtained the signatures and approved releases. Vanessa had managed document substitutions and the public narrative. Victor had designed the vendor network and directed the strategy. Their roles differed, but the evidence showed coordination. The defense lawyers emphasized uncertainty. Not every dollar had been traced. Daniel had delayed reporting. Cooperating witnesses hoped for favorable treatment. Charlotte had signed without complete review. Ethan claimed pressure. Vanessa claimed limited knowledge. Victor claimed the network was legitimate. The judge instructed the jury that suspicion was not enough. They had to apply the civil burden to each claim and each defendant. They could not use the pending federal inquiry as evidence of guilt. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Charlotte spent the waiting hours with Samuel in a nearby apartment. Margaret called only when the clerk announced a verdict. The jurors found Ethan liable for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and related misuse of Charlotte's authority. They found Vanessa liable for participating in the document scheme and reputational campaign. They found Victor liable on the central fraud and conspiracy-related claims supported by the evidence. The verdict was not identical on every count, and the jury rejected several damages theories it believed had not been proved with sufficient certainty. That made the decision more credible, not less. The jury awarded Charlotte compensation for financial losses, professional harm, and emotional injury. The court entered declaratory relief establishing, between the parties, that the disputed authorizations had been procured and used through fraud rather than informed approval. After a separate proceeding, punitive damages were awarded against the defendants in amounts tied to the findings and evidence admitted for that purpose. The judge also continued orders preserving records and referred compliance issues to appropriate authorities. She did not announce prison terms. Criminal responsibility belonged to separate proceedings. Then she addressed Charlotte. Trust can create vulnerability, the judge said. The law does not guarantee that trust will be rewarded. It does provide a remedy when another person intentionally converts trust into an instrument of deception. Outside court, reporters asked Charlotte whether she felt vindicated. "I feel believed," she said. "Vindication will be what I build after this." The federal investigation continued for another year. Victor Hale and Ethan Crawford were later charged through a separate process based on financial records, witness testimony, and evidence reviewed by prosecutors. Vanessa entered a cooperation agreement and pleaded guilty to a narrower offense. Ethan eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud-related charges. Victor went to trial and was convicted on several counts, but acquitted on others. Those criminal outcomes did not occur because a civil jury had been angry. They followed separate rules, separate defense rights, and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Crawford Holdings did not vanish overnight. A court-approved restructuring removed Victor's influence, replaced senior leadership, and protected viable projects and employee pensions. Assets connected to the scheme were pursued for restitution. The foundation recovered part of its losses and audited every grant. Charlotte completed her divorce. The matrimonial court addressed property and parenting with information from evaluators and supervised contact reports. She did not use public applause to dictate Samuel's private future. Ethan's relationship with his son would depend on accountability, safety, and orders made for the child, not on Ethan's desire to repair his reputation. 1 year after the civil verdict, Charlotte opened the Hayes Center for Financial Safety. The center helped spouses, older adults, and nonprofit leaders understand signature authority, coercive control, document substitution, and the warning signs of financial abuse. Margaret served as its first board chair. Daniel led an ethics fellowship for compliance employees who faced retaliation. Lydia created free workshops called Read the Packet, Not Just the Page. At the opening, Charlotte displayed the 2 grant packets from the trial behind glass. A visitor asked why she would preserve the documents that nearly destroyed her. "Because shame grows in secrecy," Charlotte said. "Education turns it into protection." That evening, she carried Samuel to a park overlooking the Hudson. He was old enough to walk several uncertain steps before reaching for her hand. Charlotte thought about the night she left the Crawford estate with 1 suitcase. At the time, freedom had felt like a locked door, a hospital room, and a stranger offering legal help. Now it felt ordinary. It was rent paid from her own account. It was knowing which documents carried her name. It was a child laughing without cameras nearby. Margaret joined her on the bench and handed her a newspaper. The final page contained a small article about the recovered foundation funds. Ethan's photograph appeared beneath the headline. Charlotte folded the paper. "Do you want to keep it?" Margaret asked. "No, burn it." No, Charlotte placed it in a recycling bin. She no longer needed destruction to symbolize release. As the sun lowered, Samuel pointed toward a ferry crossing the river. Charlotte lifted him so he could see beyond the railing. She had once believed justice meant proving she had never made a mistake. The case taught her something more useful. She had made a mistake. She had trusted, signed too quickly, and allowed convenience to replace review. But a mistake was not consent to betrayal. A signature was not permission to substitute pages. A marriage was not authority to borrow another person's identity. And wealth was not a license to manufacture a woman's instability before the world had heard her speak.